Have you ever reached a point where your mind simply refuses to cooperate with your programming? A moment where the heavy iron gates of your self-control collapse, and you are left standing naked in front of the world, unable to pretend anymore. That was the exact moment Sarah found herself in, standing in the middle of a brightly lit grocery store, surrounded by broken glass, spilled beer, and the cold, curious stares of strangers. For 34 years, she had been a master of emotional containment. She had swallowed her anger, her fatigue, her sadness, and her boundaries, all to keep the peace. But the human psyche is like a pressure cooker. If you never open the valve, it doesn't matter how strong the metal is, eventually, it will explode. And Sarah had just exploded. She didn't clean up the mess. For the first time in her life, she left the shattered pieces for someone else to handle. She walked out into the cold November rain, sat in her car, and stared at the steering wheel for a long, silent hour. Her phone was buzzing in her purse. David was texting, wondering where his snacks were. Her mother was calling to ask another favor. But as Sarah looked at the glowing screen, she realized something terrifying. The girl who used to rush to answer those calls, the perfect, good girl, was dead. She had died right there on the linoleum floor of the supermarket. Tonight, we are going to explore the aftermath of Sarah's collapse. We are going to dig deep into the roots of this psychological prison, discover why being a good child is often a hidden curse, and map out the exact, painful steps required to break the chains of chronic people-pleasing. If you have already watched the first part of this story, you know how heavy this weight can be. If you haven't, you can click the link on your screen right now to see how Sarah reached this point. To understand why Sarah became a woman who would rather destroy herself than disappoint her boyfriend, we have to look into the past. We have to look at the invisible architecture of her childhood home. No one is born a people-pleaser. Infants do not worry if their crying inconveniences their parents. Children naturally express their boundaries, they say no, they throw tantrums, they state their desires plainly. People-pleasing is a learned behavior. It is a survival strategy developed by a child whose environment taught them a dangerous lesson: you are only safe when you are performing. Sarah's parents were not monsters. They did not abuse her in the traditional sense. But their love was conditional, wrapped in strings that Sarah could feel even before she knew the words for it. Her father was a cold, stressed man who only smiled when Sarah brought home perfect grades. Her mother was an emotionally fragile woman who used guilt as a weapon. Whenever Sarah tried to express a negative emotion, or whenever she wanted to play instead of doing chores, her mother would sigh, press her hand to her forehead, and say, "Sarah, please, I have such a headache. Why must you always make things harder for me?" In that subtle, polite environment, Sarah's young brain made a profound and tragic calculation: my feelings cause my parents pain. If I am loud, if I am angry, if I have needs, I will lose their love. To survive, I must become invisible. I must be perfect. In modern psychology, this is known as parentification or the good child syndrome. The child learns to suppress their own authentic self to protect the fragile emotional state of the adults around them. They become the emotional caretakers of their parents. But here is the tragedy: when a child trades their authenticity for attachment, they give up their own identity. They learn to view their own natural boundaries as a crime against others. And that little girl who learned to sit quietly in the corner so her mother wouldn't get a headache grows up to be the woman who stays late in the office, accepts toxic behavior from her partner, and apologizes for simply taking up space in the world. When Sarah returned home that night, she didn't apologize. David was sitting on the couch with his friends, the game playing loudly on the TV. He looked up, annoyed, and said, "Where have you been? And where are the things?" Sarah looked at him. For the first time, she didn't see a partner she needed to please. She saw a mirror of her own childhood, someone who loved her utility, not her soul. She put her keys on the table and said, in a calm, flat voice, "I am going to sleep. Do not wake me up." David was shocked. The friends went quiet. It was a small boundary, but in a relationship built on chronic compliance, a small boundary feels like an earthquake. The next few months of Sarah's life were a dark, painful process of withdrawal. Because people-pleasing is an addiction. It is an addiction to approval, an addiction to the temporary safety of making others happy. And just like any addiction, when you try to quit, the withdrawal symptoms are brutal. When Sarah started saying no, the world didn't celebrate her healing. In fact, the world got angry. Her boss became cold and demanding when she refused to work past 6 p.m. Her mother cried on the phone, accusing Sarah of becoming selfish and distant simply because Sarah shortened their weekly calls to 15 minutes. David tried to manipulate her, saying she had changed, that she wasn't the sweet girl he fell in love with. This is the hardest truth about escaping the good child trap. When you start setting boundaries, the people who benefit from your lack of boundaries will always fight back. They will use guilt, they will use anger, they will try to convince you that you are the problem. Sarah spent many nights crying in her bed, feeling a crushing weight of guilt. Her brain, conditioned by decades of pleasing, kept screaming at her, "Fix it. Apologize. Go back to being good before everyone leaves you." But she stayed. She sat with the guilt. She let the fire burn, because she realized that this guilt wasn't a sign that she was doing something wrong. It was just the sound of her old prison walls breaking down. 1 year after her breakdown in the grocery store, Sarah was sitting in a small, quiet cafe. The late autumn sun was streaming through the window, warming her face. She was alone, and for the first time in her adult life, she didn't feel lonely. She felt peaceful. She had broken up with David. It was a quiet termination. She simply realized that he could never love a woman who had a voice. She had changed jobs, moving to a company that respected her hours and her boundaries. Her relationship with her parents was distant, but it was honest. They no longer called her to fix their lives, because they finally knew that her answer would be a calm, unyielding no. Sarah looked at her hands. The red marks from the plastic grocery bags had long since faded. But the lesson remained. She had learned that being good is a poor substitute for being whole. She had learned that the people who truly love you will never demand that you destroy your own peace to keep theirs. And most importantly, she had learned to forgive that little girl who sat quietly in the dark corner of her childhood home, trying so hard to save her parents. The journey out of the people-pleasing trap is not about becoming cold or cruel. It is about realizing that your kindness is a sacred resource. It is a gift that should be given freely, not a tax you pay to stay alive. It is about understanding that you are allowed to be inconvenient. You are allowed to be tired. You are allowed to disappoint people. Because at the end of the day, it is far better to be rejected by the entire world for being who you are, than to be loved by everyone for being someone you're not. Thank you for walking this heavy, beautiful path with us tonight at Hearts and Minds Lab. If Sarah's story felt like your own, I want you to remember that your recovery begins with the very next choice you make. The next time your inner voice screams, "No," have the courage to let your mouth say it out loud. If you found peace or clarity in this story, please subscribe to our channel. We are building a small, quiet sanctuary here for regular psychological breakdowns and real stories of emotional healing. Leave your thoughts, your guilt, and your victories in the comments below. Let's keep looking into the mirror together. Good night.